Welcome back, everyone. And this is the Global Privacy and Data Protection Leadership Meet 2022, which is brought to you by ASSOCHAM India. And we'll now begin, without wasting any time, our panel discussion on evolving of the Indian data protection journey. The approaches, the frameworks, what the industry needs, and what future it holds is what we will be discussing in detail over this next 1 hour. So now to moderate the session, we have amongst us Ms. Shivangi Nadkarni, CEO and co-founder at Arca. And as our panelists, we have Ms. Sanjana Ravamudhan, Associate Consultant, Dua Consulting. We have Mr. Supratim Chakraborty, once again, partner, Khaitan and Company. Mr. Ratan Jyoti will not be joining us, unfortunately, because of health concerns. Mr. Kumar Rajendran, Head of Data Science and Engineering at Central Data and Analytics at TVS Motor Company, will also be, in fact, sharing with us his perspective. Mr. Ramkumar Narayan, Practice Partner, Data Privacy, Risk and Compliance at Wipro Limited, is also one of the panelists on this session. And last but not the least, Mr. Sandeep Bhambure, VP and Managing Director at VM Software, is also on this afternoon panel. So without wasting any time, I will hand it over to you, Ms. Nadkarni, to take the session forward from here. We have 60 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Samriddhi, and hello, everybody. Good to have this wonderful panel, and I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion. Thank you so much, ASOCAM, for organizing this. I think the last session lay kind of the foundation very well. That was a very interesting session about the law itself, the limitations around the law, etc. We kind of switch gears in this section to talk about the other side, which is like organizational challenges in trying to ensure compliance and implement the law, right? So there are challenges, there are opportunities there as well, and that's what we look forward to discussing in this session. The way I'd like to run this is maybe we can do about 2, 3, 4 minutes, so each of you giving your preliminary thoughts on how you look at this as an approach, and then maybe we could get into specific points and terms that we'd like to discuss. So I'm just going to go by my screen. So I'll start with Sanjana. You're the first on the left, so we start with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for having me. It's such a privilege to be here, and I look forward to learning quite a bit from everyone present on this panel, as the other panels as well. I think sort of the biggest thing we need to keep in mind when we talk about data privacy and protection from like an industry perspective is I think it's important for us to understand the scope of what we're engaging with here. The digital economy in India is growing at an incredibly rapid pace, and it's fast outpacing any sort of regulator appetite for regulating it as well. We're at a place now where technological innovations far supersede what constitutes, I think, the legislative intention for how we choose to regulate these things. And given the speed at which technology is rapidly developing, it's those of us who are in the center watching technology develop and seeing how attempts to regulate it are being conducted that sort of have to figure out how to marry both of those things presently. And the truth is that the speed at which technology is evolving has thrown up a lot of really interesting challenges for us. Today, in common parlance, we have things like crypto, machine learning, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, hosting things on platforms that don't have any sort of physical presence, decentralizing data, making it now a multi-party sort of global issue where stakeholders are sometimes not even within the ambit of what regulatory agencies across different countries in the world are capable of regulating. So purely from that perspective, I think it's critical for us to understand the implications of the nature in which data is being used in these evolving technologies in order for us to therefore regulate it. And from the perspective of the bill, if you look at it, this is predominantly governance based, right? We're trying to figure out frameworks and establish patterns of behavior, so to speak, in regulating these sort of agencies that allow for us to say that X, Y, and Z are considered acceptable and A, B, and C are not and will be penalized accordingly. I think going forward, what's really critical for us to keep in mind is that the policies and the sort of principles that govern data protection and privacy need to be flexible to keep pace with the fact that technology and the needs for how we choose to regulate that the data that we choose to entrust with people who are running this kind of tech is going to change, in that the relationship between those who are entrusting data to these platforms and what these platforms can choose to do with said data going forward needs to be constantly relooked at and constantly considered in order to make sure that your data principals, your data fiduciaries, your primaries, everyone is sort of on the same page in what sort of needs to be done. And in order to achieve that, I think principally we need to be okay with sort of a more progressive data protection framework, one that is rights based, one that accounts for the fact that there is a massive lacuna now in terms of how we view tech and what tech is truly capable of doing. And in order for us to address that gap, there need to be smarter solutions. And it's going to have to come from industry players and people who are not just writing the law, but have to understand how to implement it going forward.
Great. Thanks, Sanjana. I think I'll go to the other legal expert on our panel, Shupratim. So, if you could give us some of your thoughts on this.
Shivangi, and I'll tell you the largest challenges that I'm observing right now in the market. And being on the other side, on the service provider side, I can perhaps give you a plethora of problems which have been observing across sectors, industry players, etc. I think the largest challenge is not having a natural culture of privacy. That's to my mind one of the hurdles that we will have to start addressing right from now. Okay. New entrant joins an organization, email is sent to everyone with the CV attached, welcome so and so, CV has got blood group, home address, home number. Is this really required to be known by the whole universe? Answer is no. But the HR who would have sent it perhaps just unknowingly, because it was not there in sort of embedded somewhere, that you need to think about it before you carry out that action, that whether privacy has to be taken care of in every action of yours. So I'll just keep it snappy, but the first point I want to make is that the culture of privacy is the first and foremost thing which we need to work on. The second problem which I observe is data journey, entry and exit, up to from entry to exit, what all kinds of personal or sensitive personal data is there in the organizations, no one is aware of. Okay. It's a very in fact, some of them are not even aware that there is some sensitive data sitting. I was giving an example in the first session. So that is the next one. The next one, I would say, is struggling with multiple laws if it is applicable to players. What happens is there's GDPR, there is CCPA, then there is upcoming Indian law. We have seen some catastrophic mistakes being committed. For example, we were doing an audit of a particular bank, and they said, listen, we are global gold standard compliant. We are already GDPR compliant. Forget about upcoming new present day Indian law. We are already compliant with the upcoming law. And we started looking very dipstick analysis. We were not given too much of a liberty. And we see it's saying, firstly, please understand that even under present day law, financial information is considered to be sensitive personal information. And for a bank, they're categorized as not in that category because GDPR does not categorize that as special category of personal data / sensitive personal data. So how catastrophic that mistake can be, I'll just leave it for you to imagine. Second, like rudimentary stuffs like age of consent, which is 18 years even under present day law, was kept as 16. It can go below up to 13, just like GDPR, okay? The third problem, I think, is regulatory uncertainty. How many of our laws really come with an end date for storing data? Therefore, out of fear, we are endlessly storing data. So to my mind, this is a homework for the government, that you ensure that your laws see to eye to eye. In fact, Meti had separately written to me and I had gone to Delhi and spoken. And that time, what happened is Reserve Bank of India had come with a diktat for data localization. And I said, look at the nuances that are there in this. Okay. Reserve Bank says that you can send your data outside for processing, but as soon as the processing is done, you should bring it back to the country. If you look at the definition of processing under the Data Protection Act, it has got storage. So I said, if there's a smart cookie there, we'll argue with you that it is being kept outside as for processing. That is basically storage. Once my storage functions are over, I will get it back. So please ensure that this is just an example. This is a random example, but there are many, okay? Please ensure that your laws are seeing eye to eye, right? The next one and the last one, I think, is in any organization, whose baby is it? IT, legal, compliance, all of them, and I leave it there. That's my opening comment.
Thank you, and very pertinent. I just came off a meeting into this panel where I was trying to convince a organization which has 100% presence in India about why they don't need to comply with GDPR. It's a fight because that's the perception that people have. It's the gold standard. I think I'm going to move to Ram now, who has a perspective similarly from a service provider angle. And Ram, you deal with clients across the globe. As you've been seeing these challenges for a number of years now, right? You've been running this practice for many years. Can you share with us, some of the challenges that you're seeing around the world, which you think are going to be common that even Indian organizations are going to face?
Well, thank you for
Ram, your voice is not very clear. Can you just check your mic or
Can you
speak
hear
a
me?
little closer? Yeah,
Can
yeah,
you,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So just want to start, begin by thanking for giving an opportunity to participate in this panel and for inviting me in this global privacy and data protection beat. So from my perspective, if you look at challenges, right, organizations across the globe are facing numerous challenges. One is to do with knowledge of the data flow within the enterprise, right? They do not know what type of data is being collected, stored, processed. So understanding the data landscape is a massive, massive exercise where we see organizations are investing their time and money on, documenting what kind of data we collect, store, with whom do we share, all of that information, massive amount of time and amount being spent on that. The second challenge that we have seen is more around the uh, who owns the privacy function. This we have a differing view across countries. If you look at Europe, there is a view of legal owning the privacy function. If you look at the US markets, we see a trend of a privacy office being as a concept being evolved, and where there is a function that owns the privacy, operationalizing privacy and other things. And if you look at the other challenges in inculcating a culture of privacy, where organizations struggle because it is not just a privacy function doing implementing certain controls, because it has to be from the grassroots of the different business functions, the application teams, the developers. It has to be at that level for an organization to succeed in implementing and operationalizing privacy, right? And we also see organizations struggling in terms of managing consents. This is another challenge that we have seen. How do we manage consents on a dynamic basis while the regulations are giving the data subject, in terms of revoking consents? This involves a massive change in the application design, re-architecting and redesigning an application levels. So that's another challenge that we have seen. And the of late, with adoption of new horizon technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning, implementing these kind of technologies solutions into an enterprise landscape, how do we build privacy by design into that, so that it is not an afterthought and we do not end up spending more amount of our efforts there to putting it as a afterthought, right? So that's another big challenge that we have seen across global scale, privacy perspective. These are consistently that we have seen as a challenge across all enterprises, regardless of industries they are in, regardless of what countries they are in. And these are some of the common challenges that we have seen, based on our experience so far on a global scale, Shivaki.
Thanks, Rang. I think you echo what Pratim said in terms of data journeys, cultures, ownership, right? And also managing consents for sure. We see that as well, and new tech. So while you have a lot of people jumping around about new tech and startups and innovation around that, I think the reality of actually implementing it gives lots of people sleepless nights, right? So thank you. Another interesting point that you mentioned about culture, considering you mainly dealt with organizations outside India, and that you mentioned that is interesting because many people are under this impression that hey, privacy as a culture is absent only in our country, right? And at the organization level, so it's good to know that this is the same challenge across the world, and it's not just unique to us as India. because we tend to often confuse, culture of privacy in terms of, societal culture vis-a-vis organizational culture of data privacy, which is actually the two different things, right? So thanks for that. I think I'll go over to Kumar now. And Kumar, you are in the hot seat, actually facing the challenges that all of them have been talking about. I'd like to hear your perspective about how do you really manage this on the ground level at an organization so large and widespread as yours.
Okay, and thanks a lot, Ashcham, for giving me the opportunity. Yes, just a brief context. I run a data privacy program group wide that includes all group companies for TVS. And the journey started with data management and governance initially, and now we've pivoted to data privacy. So all my experiences I'm going to be sharing is with the context of having run a data management and governance program, and then trying to incorporate a data privacy framework into it. One of the big challenges for us is, and to be honest, some of these discussions are cathartic, right? Because as an engineering person, as a data scientist, I'm good at following laws, not critically evaluating them. So I'm glad that some of these laws are being critically evaluated, right? So first is privacy by design. It's good to develop applications, and it's greenfield to have it designed by privacy in mind. But most of the applications in an enterprise, especially a large enterprise like us, have a lot of applications which are not built for privacy. So we have to start looking at how do we re-architect some of these? Where do they store information? What sort of mechanisms do we put in place to ensure that it's compliant with the law? So that's a big question mark for us. And as we do this privacy journey, we've had to look back at some of our earlier applications and re-review where they stand in terms of privacy. So we've done a lot of privacy impact analysis and had to kind of relook at how do we scale this across the globe, since as a company we operate in about 65 odd countries. Another important issue is as we operate in some jurisdictions which already have a law, and of course in India we have a law which is just taking shape. We are having to manage privacy consent, and one of the key attributes of privacy consent is defining the purpose for which you're getting consent for. Now, what granularity do we go and express our purposes for which we're gaining consent? That's not very clearly defined. Somebody talked about minimalization of exposure of what we want to do in terms of algorithms. So we want to kind of restrict and protect our trade practices, at the same time give enough information to a data principle as to what we intend to do with the data. That's a bit of a gray area for us. Uh, a lot of panelists have spoken about regulatory ambiguity. And that, in my mind, is a big deterrence for design principles. As we rapidly embrace digital technologies, I think we'd like to put in place digital assets, which we engage with our potential customers. Now, and the approach we took when we started this journey was, listen, there are a bunch of things which we would anyways want to do, irrespective of what the law would say and what shape the law would take. And then we would fork at some point in time basis exactly what the law states. Now, that fork is constantly getting pushed as the law gets delayed. And that's a bit of a concern for us because we have a program in place. We have a lot of allied programs to ensure that we are rolling out digital assets. At the same time, we don't have regulatory clarity. Of course, non-personal data is a big issue for us because apart from taking a lot of personal data, we are a mobility solutions provider. We do collect a lot of telematics data in terms of behavior patterns, etc. Now that becomes a big concern if the law also states that non-personal data would come within the ambit. So that's a bit of a concern for us, and that took us by surprise. Another issue, and I think Supratim very well laid out, is education by multiple players within the data ecosystem. And we are a B2B2C company, so we have a lot of channels through which we sell our products and services. And sometimes it's not very clear as to who the data controller would be and who the data processor would be, and what sort of legal frameworks we would need to establish between our intermediaries so that they can handle data, or they can collect data, or they can process data compliant with the law. And some of these intermediaries are not very sophisticated players. They are proprietorships in a tier 2 or tier 3 town, and they might not pay a lot of heed to data privacy as of now. So how do we deal with these kind of situations as we move forward is a big area of study for us as a team internally. Of course, I'd like to share some more experiences, but I'll probably leave it for a later time. Thank you.
Thanks, Kumar. Yeah, I mean, seeing the kind of challenges that you talked about is, in fact, in a way, saying that you have to bake in ambiguity into programs that are so widespread and structured with so many downstream impacts is not at all easy, right? But that's the reality that you're kind of living with today. So I think I'll now come to Sandeep. I was kind of reserving you till the end, Sandeep, because you offer solutions for a lot of these challenges, right? So I'd like to hear your thoughts and how you think, how you approach building solutions in this kind of a scenario.
Yeah, thank you, Shivangi, first of all, for having me here. Thank you so much. Quite interesting perspectives. And Supratim, I really like the point and the homework that you've given to the regulators that they need to put an expiry date, for the data that is creating around us. And we know that the digital universe is doubling every 2 years, right? So it's a big challenge in front of everyone. But, I will be giving a perspective from the software solution provider because, we have been helping customers day in, day out to protect their data. And I completely agree with, several viewpoints from the panelists here. We have a very interesting situation. We've seen decades of transformation, happen over the last couple of years, and that has actually changed, the requirements of organizations and IT to protect information. Whatever solutions, technologies, or modes that were available to protect data or used to protect data, a couple of years back, decades back, are no longer, meeting the requirements of business. We've seen organizations like we went around the world. We spoke to
Sandeep, your voice is slightly lower and cracking. If you could speak a little closer to the.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, this is better.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I was talking about a study that we conducted. We went around the globe, spoke to more than 3,000 decision makers in IT to understand from them what is important as far as data protection is concerned. And we had some very stark findings from this study, and I'll just share a few with you. 84% of customers actually mentioned that they faced some sort of ransomware attack. Now look at it from the perspective of all the security measures that organizations have taken over decades, spend millions of dollars to beef up the security, whether it's perimeter security or information security. And despite that, if they are facing ransomware attack or breach, into their security and the critical information assets. I mean, it's a very thought-provoking, observation that we had, and it very clearly tells us that we have to be prepared for when that the attack is going to happen, that there would be a breach of information, whether it is intentional, unintentional, from outsiders, insiders, is immaterial. But whenever that happens, are we prepared for it? And that is why we see organizations are putting together, very solid data protection, strategy or platform, and adopting technologies so that they build the last line of defense. That when a breach does happen and your data gets compromised, can I bring up the IT? Can I bring up that organization? And can I make my business resilient? So this is what I think has been the top priority for IT decision makers and businesses around the world. Another observation that we had is, while the overall IT investments could only grow by a few percentage points, but the investment in data protection is expected to grow double that of the pace of IT investments, which means that customers are really taking cognizance that yes, data is under threat, business is under threat, and let me allocate more money to protect all this information on which my business is surviving. So so the last line of defense is something that we think that customers are really serious about when they're thinking about data protection.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sandeep. So, that I'd like to actually begin by taking up one of the points that was brought up in terms of, who owns this. And this has been sparked by, Sandeep talking about a lot of challenges which are very specific to data security and protection, right? And, that is, which is one aspect of the whole privacy and data protection debate. And therefore there is, as we've seen, while implementing a data privacy kind of compliance program, there is the security aspect, there is the legal aspect, there is the whole aspect around other issues like what Kumar mentioned about purpose. There is the issue about managing culture, businesses being impacted at a very core level, not being able to do what they've been doing for many, many years with their data, this whole aspect of taking data for granted. Now, given the spread of this, what do you think are, or what are you observing, and your thoughts on, where data privacy overall should lie? Should it be with one sort of organization? Should it be spread out? Ram talked about how he's seeing different trends in EU versus the US. There is no right answer. So maybe, we should have some discussion around that. I'll begin again in the same sort of order. So maybe we'll start with you, Sanjana. And, where do you see, for example, legal organizations playing a role in this whole thing?
Presently, with the sort of organizations that I've had the chance to work with who suddenly have all of these privacy concerns, sort of the larger issue that they're facing right now is understanding what their responsibilities under this framework are. Their larger issue seems to be in trying to identify what these distinctions are, what's personal data, what's non-personal data, why one needs to be governed a certain way, what these data localization norms are. And sort of the larger concern they have is because a lot of the organizations that I work with tend to be on the startup side who are trying to create more innovative sort of business solutions for existing problems. Suddenly, what they thought were smart solutions to existing issues can no longer be implemented in the exact same way. And that's now a 3-month problem that we're all trying to address and we're trying to keep pace with. If you look at, for example, a fintech startup that's trying to do like small tenure, small amount loans, suddenly their means of authenticating and verifying who's going to be borrowing from them, how they're going to follow up with them in order to recover their costs have now changed. Because the truth of it is, a lot of these sort of tech solutions that have come up are low cost alternatives to a lot of conventional business models. And as a consequence, because there is so much ambiguity in how we're going to be regulating data that's collected through these solutions, because they're critical for these solutions to function in a certain manner, there's a lot of ambiguity with regards to how they should be structuring their options and how they should be going forward. And this becomes more and more of an issue if you look at, I mean, like I said, fintech, where there's banking and critical data of that sort, but also if you look at people working in content outreach where they're effectively are there significant social media intermediaries, do their obligations now increase because they have a chat feature on the app that previously would not have been something they considered to be a particular privacy hit vis-a-vis now where it suddenly is. Going forward, I think uh, therefore sort of the larger industry issue that I see and I face most frequently is people now trying to come up with solutions to things that they didn't see as problems just a little while ago. So, from both, I'd say, the consulting perspective and the legal perspective, sort of the largest thing we're trying to do now is figure out what we think is going to happen basis what's in the JPC report and what's in the draft bill, and also trying to see what could potentially be the next step after that. Because I think everyone on the panel and all the other really interesting contributions to today, I think we can by and large agree that this is very much a work in progress sort of field of both governance and regulation. And if that's the case, then I think everyone who sort of at least interestingly sits in that interstitial space between this is regulation and this is implementation has to now sort of try and figure out what the next step therein as well is. But I'd say the largest issue right now is ambiguity and sort of trying to A, figure out how it's going to apply locally, and B, how it's going to pan out on a global scale, not just because of the multiplicity of laws that exist, but because tech now um, can't be within the framework of each sovereign country also regulated effectively. And therefore, if we're now talking about things like cross-border data flows and how to decentralize data, but still sort of for all of our national security concerns and other things have access to them, those are sort of questions that I think need to be answered on like a global level as well. And without those, I'd say we're going to see some implementation issues on the ground.
Okay, thanks, Sanjana. I'm actually going to ask Kumar the next question. So, Kumar, Sanjana laid out the complexity so beautifully and how you need to spend time trying to understand and then figure out and all that. You are doing the equivalent of, as they say, to use a very, cliche, is like building the airplane on the runway, right? And you are trying, you don't have the luxury of time to figure out all of this because you have to make things happen. Now in this case, how do you get various people who are at different levels of maturity with different programs, sort of come together? Where do you think it should be, and what are the things that you as the head of privacy will own directly, and which are the ones where you rely on other teams for you to make things happen? Your thoughts?
Fantastic question. So I'll answer the second one first, right? Where should a privacy org reside? And we debated this a lot, and we went to people who have already done this, and it's not an easy answer. Some people say it should be the CISO leading it. Some people saying it's a different team should be leading it, directly reporting to a CIO or with a CEO. So there's no clear answer. But what we realized is uh, any team running data privacy should have a couple of things within them, skills within them. They should have some sort of a legal skill within them. There should be some sort of tech skills, because I think eventually data privacy is tech implemented, right? So we need to have tech skills within that. And then we should need to have some sort of a business input, right? Because they are the ultimate custodians. And since I come from a data management and governance background, wherein the various functions own data, we say that we'll keep it at a place which is at arm's length distant from the people producing it. So we'll not leave it to a business, we'll not leave it to an IT organization, but we'll keep it within the analytics organizations. They don't produce data, so there's no conflict of interest. But we did something different. We said we'll probably pick a couple of lawyers who understand privacy very well and who can probably guide us in our journey. So we have lawyers in my team. We have people from the business who moved in to kind of understand how is data being used so that we can probably mature our purpose. And we ensure that the whole setup is governed by a governance council. And that governance council is led by different businesses. So we said that we'll take a person from the HR, we'll take a person from marketing, we'll take somebody from sales, we'll take somebody from internal quality control, any control function like audit. So we got in a council to oversee this. So that in a way satisfied a lot of all these internal obligations to having arm's length distance between people producing it. At the same time, we are like dispassionate and objective in terms of how we look at privacy. So that's how we started off in terms of like where we place it. Now, the next question is in terms of how do we implement this, right? And since we're operational in about 60 odd countries, now it's 90, some of these countries we operate already have laws. And when we some of our systems are common systems across different geographies. So you cannot have a system which is built for like a jurisdiction which has a law and for one which does not have a law. So we have to take the highest common denominator and then probably architect your system. And at the same time, we do not have the luxury of having a law, right? So as any computer scientist would say, and any startup entrepreneur will say, bootstrapping is a great approach, right? So what we said is we will first see what works, build small bits of it, see if it works everywhere else, see if it works within our own organization, because we didn't have structures in place in terms of, let's say, who's going to take up the role of, let's say, any breach happens, how do we actually take note cognizance of it? How do you put in controls in place? So we did not have a lot of these processes in place. So we said we'll bootstrap it. As we wrote our data privacy policies, we actually implemented side by side. We did not say we'll put a policy in place and then implement it. We said we'll probably do a bit of policy, we'll implement it and see if it works, and then probably iterate on a policy. So bootstrapping is what we did, and we're continuing to do that. We are nowhere close to completing it. I think we're still in the journey, but I think we're learning a lot from this whole approach, because many a times I think it's easy to say something on paper, and it's okay when we read a policy regulation that this is doable. But when you go to the ground, when you start looking at the different systems in place, different people who touch the systems and different ways they touch systems, it's a nightmare sometimes to kind of like then harmonize everyone. So yes, it is a lot of education, a lot of drive from the top, because I think if you want to be a serious player in the data ecosystem, you have to build that trust. A lot of people have spoken about that trust. To gain that trust, it does take a lot of effort, and we are in that journey as we speak. So those are my 2 cents and my contribution to that topic.
Excellent. I like the way you turned the whole thing on its head by saying, focus on the skills required rather than the kind of structure, and, bootstrap, iterate, learn, and then, sort of make it a continual kind of process, so that you're not doing this on this massive, strategy and big time layouts, and, do it in small packets so that you can continuously sort of learn and build from the fabulous way of looking at dealing with the various curveballs that come your way every day. I'm going to ask the three folks on our panel who work as service providers and solution providers, is what are you seeing across your various clients? Because as we just discussed, there is no one answer, there's no right or wrong, right? Everything works within the context on the reality of organizations. So, I'd love to hear your views. Maybe we'll start with Sandeep and then, Ram and Supratim.
Thanks, Shivangi. Terrific input. Kumar, that we don't want to really boil the ocean. I think we start with something more palatable and in a small format and make things happen. So, and that's a very interesting perspective, quite practical on ground. So, I mean, when I talk to customers, across the country and the geography, like, one common observation which I see customers recognizing today is that, data could get originated anywhere. We see data originating out of, your data centers on the edge, in the cloud. Customers are generating, vendors are generating, wherever it is getting, or even machines are generating so much of data. Wherever the data gets generated, as long as that is your data, you are in charge of that data and you are responsible for protecting that information or that data asset. And that is a very big recognition which customers are having. And actually that came from a fact that many customers today are looking at adopting cloud in a big way. You have data on SaaS, where data could be residing anywhere, but it's your data. And earlier the thought process was, well, as long as I adopt cloud and put my applications on the cloud, my data on cloud, I don't really need to worry about anything. But there is a very strong realization that as CIOs and CTOs, you need to be protecting all of this information, and hence there IT is really taking a relook at their data protection strategy. Okay. If it was in the data center on physical machines, there was a way of protecting all this information. But now, with the complexities around us, the data needs to be protected differently. And then drawing from what Kumar spoke about, customers are saying, let me then, instead of just doing away with, all the legacy that I have built over the years, to protect or invest in technology to protect all the information. Why don't I look at, more modern applications or use cases or even greenfield projects where I could actually experiment, or innovate or do something more transformational and disruptive. And that is where customers are seeing a scope of introducing more innovative technologies around protection of data. And by the way, that's also quite compelling because the old technologies never work for the new world today. And this is really becoming compelling across the world, for IT. Uh, and while that being said, there is another perspective that I am also experiencing from my interactions with CISOs around the world, that they are more concerned now about the data protection, not just security, but how data is getting protected. So there's much more closer interactions between the infrastructure, cloud, and the CISO team. And that's really driving a lot of transformation around data protection in IT.
Great, thank you. That helps. I mean, looking at data from a protection angle, cloud, CISOs, infrastructure, etc. Ram, your thoughts on this?
So if you look at one of the very foundational aspect in terms of managing a privacy, in an enterprise is to have a cross-functional and very diverse set of team to operationalize the privacy program. Because when you have a cross-functional team, you bring in a lot of ideas and a lot of thoughts to into the privacy mix, and that will help to take decision in terms of how best do we operationalize certain aspects, right? And that too, there is a need to have somebody called as a privacy champion who could front end these kind of efforts in an enterprise, who would have multiple skill sets, who have a very good understanding of legal, the regulatory landscape, the technology side of things, and how we can operationalize and implement things like your data minimization, and implement who can act as a culture bearer, and who can act as an influencer within an enterprise, which can help in embedding a privacy aware culture, in ingraining some of the core best practices in an enterprise from a privacy perspective. So that will help to go a long way in terms of how best we can operationalize and be successful. It is a matter of culture which will decide where it could fit in, or where it could be successful. But these are some of the key considerations that one should look at in terms of how we can operationalize the privacy aspects into an enterprise, Shivani.
Interesting. I just want to ask you a further question.
Hmm?
How do you contrast styles of what you're seeing in Europe versus maybe the US or in other countries?
Yeah, see, because of GDPR in Europe, we have a mandatory data privacy officer role in an enterprise, right? So that is where DPO becoming a very foundational aspect in those enterprise. Now, if you look at US, it is more of sectoral privacy, and where they say
Just a
statewide.
minute. Sorry, just a minute. Can I request everybody other than the panelists to please be on mute? Thank you.
Sure.
Yes, Ram, go ahead.
Yeah. So in terms of if you look at contrast to Europe, in US markets, right, where it's more of sectoral privacy, where the statewide privacy regulations, and each and every state has its own set of privacy regulation. See, the adoption is also very different when it comes to European markets. So where we see a privacy function, some cases where we see legal owning that, where we see a cross-functional teams that are owning that. So different varieties of approach that we see in the US markets. But the common trend that we see is that when an organization start on privacy, they try to get the function aligned with the CISO, because it's more related to implementing controls and protecting the data. And then once the organization start showing some kind of maturity, then they try to bring in some roles and bring in some kind of rhythm to operationalize and improve the maturity of the program over a period of time.
Great, thank you. And Supratim, your views on this?
An example, perhaps. I think the day before GDPR came into effect, I had a gentleman coming to my office from one of the large organizations in the country and said that my boss has sent me to you. Here is the draft of my privacy policy and terms of use. If you can just make minimal edits, and I'll upload it tonight, tomorrow morning onwards, we are GDPR compliant. I had coffee with him and kind of explained to him, this is what the law doesn't want you to do. Okay, no lip service, please. So I think we have come a long way from there. The way I would, as a lawyer, look at it, I think a prudent measure could be, the first part is the training part of it in any organization. Okay. And trainings are of various categories. The same training or presentation or session cannot be had for the board of directors and the last person on the floor, right? So if you have to get buy-in, it will be a very short session with very sharp focused, where you talk to the top leadership and get the buy-in that what you intend to do and how you go about doing it. The second layer is people who are in the mid-rung, managers who would be taking care of the one layer up basically than the implementation. And the last one is, say, workshop for a day or two, explaining to the legal, compliance, all other team members, how do you craft all of this and put it into action, right? So this is first piece. The second piece is understanding the real gap, the delta. And trust me, if you realize that the organization has done nothing, then there is no point going into a gap analysis. The answer will be zero. So I have seen many organizations, they spend tons and tons, and they say, now we have come up with a gap analysis, which is basically nothing is there. Okay. So therefore, the second aspect is basically figuring out where am I and where do I need to go. And there I think we can do a slicing and dicing. It's very difficult for organizations, especially in India, sometimes to cope up with such large, scheme of things to be done. So we pick up the easiest one, say research and development, okay, which may not have too much of heavy PI, SPDI, and all of that, and we do a test run with that. Now, once that is successful, then you go vertical by vertical, and you can then, it'll be a better sort of proposition, perhaps. And the last thing is, after all of this, a strategy to be planned out and then implemented after discussion with the relevant stakeholders. The problem that we are right now facing with several organizations is they would read all of this buzz in the market and want a quick fix or a one-stop shop solution. That, you fix it tonight, tomorrow morning, like I was mentioning, we should be compliant. It's a journey. I think all of us would agree that this particular, privacy program would be definitely a journey. And regulators also understand across the globe, by the way. If you look at examples from GDPR, etc., if you can demonstrate compliance, you are largely kind of able to defend yourself. Then you cannot say that I don't do anything and be, safe. So if you are able to demonstrate reasonable compliance and say that, okay, ABC are the things that we have done, even after this, say a breach has occurred, I think the leniency aspect comes down quite a bit into that discussion when you're discussing with the regulator. So I'll pause there.
Right. Thank you. I think very important points that I'm going to use to go to my next question. And we have about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to combine a couple of questions and, ask you to share your thoughts. One is that, many people have this, especially non-lawyers, okay, have this belief that I can, comply with the law. It's like a, checklist, and there will be somebody who will come and certify that I'm compliant with the law. So the fact that that doesn't happen, and that you need something in between, right, coupled with the fact that when you have multiple laws, multiple jurisdictions, trans-border, etc., you really need some kind of a framework on which is what you implement, and then you use that to comply with the law. So some thoughts I'd like to hear from you all in terms of what are the kind of frameworks that one can use, what are the kind of standards that one can use, and what, in the same question, I'd like to also ask you to include your thoughts on what would you like to see to make the life of organizations a little bit less complicated. I won't use the term anywhere near easy, less complicated, so that you're able to actually implement. And stay out of, we all, ambiguity is one thing and we can't do anything about it, but any specific measures, if at all, you think that can help, let's say from policymakers, from the government, that can help you make your life a little easier than what it is currently. Actually, I'd like to start with Ram, and I'd like you to even quote a few examples of where some economies or some countries which are a little bit more mature than where we are, and if there's anything that we can sort of take leaves out of their books.
Absolutely, Shivangi. So, if you look at globally, right, from a privacy standard, there are certain standards that are emerging. So privacy, but again, it is more of sectoral. There is no global standard that we see. We see some markets adopting ISO 27701 standard. Some emerging economies are adopting those kind of standard. If you look at US, NIST is a very prominently adopted standard in terms of various privacy requirements, and we also have seen adoption of the GAP framework for some of the sectoral industries and pockets of industries in the US region. And we also, of late, we see organizations trying to implement what we call as a unified privacy framework. Especially enterprises that has global presence, they try to consolidate and define a framework that will help them to comply with multiple privacy regulations and implement those kind of frameworks to comply with from a privacy perspective. And to answer your second question on what can be done better, by based on our experience, but as long as there are some kind of guidance provided by the regulators in terms of how to operationalize and translate the policy, the regulatory requirements to policies and frameworks, I think that will help to go a long way in terms of how organizations can operationalize privacy. Second aspect, can be looked at is to provide more clarity in terms of the language, the the verbiage in the legal terms, so that it is not something that can be interpreted by the legal team in one way, by the enterprise in way. It should be more transparent so that people are able to operationalize and implement and be successful in the privacy journey. And the third thing that I would look at it is that it should be in line with the global privacy regulations. So if you look at post GDPR, many of the countries are starting to follow the GDPR route. Be it Brazil, be it other countries, they are trying to follow that as a standard, baseline that as a standard, and go with that so that they are able to make success in those journeys. So these are some of the things that I would like to highlight in terms of what will make the life easier for organizations.
Thank you. Excellent points. Ram, Kumar, what about you?
First, I like Ram's point about unified privacy framework. And we work in a similar kind of environment where we have to kind of work in different jurisdictions which have different laws. And then luckily for us, we came across DSCI privacy framework, which was built for NASSCOM, built by NASSCOM, right? Which probably deals with how Indian exporters work in different jurisdictions which have laws. So we personally used the DPF, the DSCI privacy framework. And we did something different. We said that since we are an organization which values tangible progress, so we had to kind of tell to the business that we are making progress. So we ourselves came up with a more proprietary data privacy maturity model, which said that how do we actually start with defining where your privacy data inventory is, how do you look at your policies, then how do you implement those policies, and then finally how do you get regulatory compliance. So we have a four-pronged approach and a 6 levels of all of that, right? So we have a framework which we developed internally. Of course, it's inspired by another framework which we use for data maturity. But this is something which we adopted as a framework, and this has helped us a lot so that we don't, we have a North Star where we work towards on a month-to-month basis, a quarter-to-quarter basis, because the privacy program we are running is across multiple different countries and multiple different companies also, group companies. So we had to have a standard scale in terms of how we mature, how we look at our progress, and how we have a standard framework as to how we measure progress. So that's the innovation which we try to do internally. And luckily for us, the DPF is fairly comprehensive, and we've looked at different regulations across the world, and it covers most of it. And it's, in a sense, a highest common denominator of a lot of regulations globally. So we've used that. Coming to your second question as to what can be done better, again, I'll probably take a leaf out of Ram's note. Less ambiguity in terms of our regulation, right? I think at times the tech community is willing to go the extra mile to kind of make solutions as long as we have a North Star in place, right? If you do not have that, I think it's going to be difficult for us to kind of comply with it. So more clarity on the regulations. And the second one is speed, right? We are an organization which wants to be at the forefront of, let's say, being compliant with privacy regulations. And since some of our jurisdictions where we operate are already having laws, we want to have speed. So speed is of the essence, and we'd like to get there faster than slower because it is coming our way, and we not want to kind of reinvent the wheel once we do something, and then again another law comes in which supersedes the existing law. So need for speed, and given that I think we are already a decade old into the whole social data situation. I think 2010 to 2020 is the whole social data period, and we are already 2 years into it, and we still don't have a privacy law. And that's pretty concerning for us as an economy, because we don't want to be in a place where a lot of our countries and even our neighboring countries, some of them are moved very fast in terms of having data privacy laws, right? I think as we grapple with this, I know there are a lot of complex issues, but I think as one of my co-panelists said earlier, we could have a more graded approach in terms of having this whole data privacy. We do not have to have a big bang, solve the world's problem in one regulation. We can probably start somewhere and probably graduate or mature from that. And that's a good place to start with, in my opinion.
Great, thank you. And in fact, I'm going to, ask the two lawyers on our panel to comment on, what both of them have talked about. And if you could actually talk a little bit about, do you think stuff like codes of practice, which brings some structure at a vertical level, would help and, reduce some of the ambiguity while giving certain specifics out? Your thoughts. So, Prateek, I'll start.
Sure. So I think, let me tell you, this discussion we have had with Justice Sri Krishna Committee, and I've been fortunate that I traveled across the country to hear many of the consultation meets, okay, to understand the real pain point of industry and all that. And what we set sailing with is basically an umbrella legislation, that we need to have an umbrella legislation under which sectoral regulations, etc., can just fit in, right? So we never wanted to be granular with this law, but we wanted to keep avenue for industry associations, etc., to keep coming up with codes which can be helpful for organizations. Okay, and that is where I think we should be headed, because if you want the India to progress and reach where they want to reach in their digital journey, and ensure that there is no frustration of innovation, this is the way to go. You cannot have your mother legislation talk about granular details. If you had law for pagers, it would be in dustbin today, right? So we had Information Technology Act. So we drafted it in a manner which is a little umbrella legislation which survives for longer period of time. That is the intent. I think that's the way to go.
Excellent. I mean, excellent point. Thank you so much. Sanjana, what would you recommend, in addition to this, especially we are a country which is trying to balance nimble, fast-paced startups with large organizations like, the TVS Group, who are scaling rapidly, to the reality is that we have a huge legacy as well. So how does a country manage all of this yet, pick up speed, because we're already behind the curve?
Really curious things, right? Wherein I agree that granularity does tend to create certain problems, in that most granular things tend not to have that much wide-reaching applicability. But quite aside from the ambiguity involved with this present piece of table legislation and everything that's been discussed in all of the consultative meetings the JPC has taken so far in arriving at this end result, sort of the thing we need to understand is that even though we're a decade into discussions about privacy, it still is a very big sort of 30,000 feet level thing for a lot of people that are trying to engage with it realistically. And there are some of us that have a little bit more sort of understanding of what it means in terms of real tangible outcomes. But for a lot of people out there who are trying to engage at it, not just as large conglomerates, but as startups, but as people who are trying to, who from the consumer end are trying to engage with these organizations, either startups or otherwise, these are very esoteric sounding things. And so I think the way to go is what has been discussed here already, which is that each sort of smaller subset of groups, either within trade organizations or within industry standards or industry standard regulating organizations, need to sort of identify that there are a couple of things that we can't possibly do without. And we'll start by doing those and then sort of evolve from there. And I think this could be, we need to start with compliances at the smallest level, right? Even if you don't fully understand what this constitutes in terms of a breach of privacy or the kind of content that's being hosted not being acceptable to the consumer and to the organization, I'd say you start with things like redressal mechanisms. You start with things like identifying areas in which you can industry-wide lodge complaints when you feel like certain things aren't happening, so that you can do sort of rooted, grounded advocacy that's based in real issues that we have. Because yes, there are larger principal issues that need resolving. But in real terms, how many of those issues are going to play out in a manner that you can tangibly tie to solutions? You're only going to be able to identify once all these problems sort of become larger, more focused, and we're capable of looking at them in the eye and saying, okay, this is basically what we're trying to do. So I'd say, yes, we need to have a lot more conversation about how these legislations themselves can become better and how within each organization, especially sophisticated ones, I'm sure are capable of keeping pace with both technological thought and legislative thought. But for the larger majority of us, I'd say we need to create systems wherein we're capable of putting names to problems so that we can then say this is the next sort of thing we need to talk about when we're doing consultative rounds. This is the sort of area we need to identify to engage with when it comes to discussing things with the government, etc., going forward.
Thank you. Excellent points. And I think, Sandeep, you'll have the honor of wrapping it all up with your thoughts before we kind of close the curtains on this panel. You're on mute, Sandeep.
Yes, thanks, Shivangi. So I was talking to a group of bankers, sometime back, and we speak about data protection and what the regulator has, advised, and I came across an interpretation that we need to store our data offsite into tapes, and that's why we are investing so much of money into tapes. And then when I looked at the regulation, really, there was no mention of tapes. So, to Supratim's point as well as Sanjana, I mean, so yeah, we do understand that, there needs to be no ambiguity in the regulatory framework, but sometimes it could help to just be prescriptive because, generally IT could tend to follow, or organizations just could follow whatever is written in the book without trying to really decipher, something more rational, out of the regulatory framework. Coming to the internal IT from the data protection standpoint, what I would recommend, to IT is, I mean, we've seen almost 84% of organizations see a data protection gap, 87% see an availability gap. So how do you mitigate all this risk around? So we have, I would recommend a rule or a framework which you can say 32110 framework or rule, where you carry two copies of backup, one, I mean, both the copies stored in two different medias, okay, on-prem and off-prem as well. And then the copy that is off-prem, which is off-site, could be completely immutable and safe and offline, secure from any ransomware kind of a threat. So that can actually help you, secure all the information that you have. And at the same time, while you're backing up your data, it is important to look at, the data going through all the checks and balances so that it's 100% recoverable. So essentially, your production copy and two backup copies, following the 32110 framework is what I would kind of generally recommend, to IT organizations across the country.
Great. Thank you so much. And I think we've just made it in time. So thanks a lot once again to all the excellent insights shared by all of you. And thank you, Asocham, once again for giving us all an opportunity to discuss this. Over to you. Back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Nadkarni, for so flawlessly moderating the session for us, and of course, all of our panelists for that very insightful discussion. It was indeed a very, very interactive session. And thank you once again for, in fact, also finishing in time.